All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Zach Rattner today. Zach is a Chief Technology Officer and co-founder at Yembo. He's a software engineer with over 15 years of experience. He has a BS in computer engineering from Virginia Tech. And Yembo is the company Yembo is the leader in AI-powered virtual surveys with over 2 million videos inspected on customers in over 20 countries. Zach's previous projects include building a flashcard studying tool that scaled to over 1 million users and serving as the software lead for Qualcomm's internal innovation program. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this on right? All good? Cool. Well, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for coming here. My name is Zach, and I work at a relatively obscure startup called Yembo, but we do have one other person from Yembo here, if I can put Emily on the spot, fellow Hokie. Thank you for coming. And I'm here today to talk about why I'm personally so optimistic for the future that AI is opening up for all of us. I've been working in the AI space since 2016 when my company was founded, and it seems like just in the last year or two, things have really picked up. And my goal here today is to go over why, to go over the opportunities that it opens up, and some ways that we can take advantage of it as electrical engineers and such. So some quick background on myself so you know who I am and why I'm standing here. I went to Virginia Tech, graduated and worked at a telecom company called Qualcomm, working on the signal bar team. So if you're ever driving 70, 80 miles an hour down the highway and you go out of range of one tower into range of the next, and you don't drop the call, there was a team of about 30-ish people. I was one of them for a while, and that was our job. The really low-level C embedded system kind of stuff. Did that for a few years. It was great. I think they were shipping about 1 billion handsets a year at the time when I was there. I think it's a bit more now. But after a few years of doing that, I figured there's more to life than signal bars and started looking around for what else was out there. And got to join an innovation team where I met my now co-founder. And this was 2015 when I switched over. And if you were following computer vision technology then, this is when the ImageNet competition was kind of the premier way that you could benchmark academic or corporate research labs would submit these submissions. And you can think of it, if you're not familiar with it, like a 1,000-way multiple choice test. So I may hold up a picture of a barn and say, what is this? And you should say barn. And the training data set had about 1,000 different categories. And in 2015, Microsoft had a submission that beat out a college-educated human in terms of accuracy. It was a relatively obscure finding, but what we learned was computers are better than people at identifying objects and images, and it seemed like relatively nobody knew about it. Didn't even make Google Zeitgeist that year. And you fast forward to about 8 years later, where we are now, and we are live in about 20, 30 different countries all over the world. Every day we process hundreds of hours of videos inside folks' homes. We can identify the objects that are there, which is useful if you're a moving company and you want to identify how many crew members do I need to relocate somebody, or how many trucks do I need? Or in the property insurance space, what is replacement cost value if there were to be a catastrophe and I need to replace this house? So this process, it looks like it's sort of inevitable today, but back at that time when that decision was made, there was a very conscious effort around putting ourselves in an industry that was relatively low tech, that didn't understand the advancements that had just happened fundamentally. And fast forward that now, and it's very difficult to kind of catch up because every day we're collecting more and more data and we're just learning so fast that it would be hard to, I believe, create something that can do the same thing. So what does Yembo do? I can talk a lot about it, but here's a couple examples. I know the Zoom makes it a bit blocky, but we can scan a video of a space. Even if it's not a pro level iPhone, you don't need the LiDAR data. We can build 3D models. We can pull out high resolution imagery. You can create measurements on that. So if you're getting like a painting estimate or something, you can figure out how many square feet of walls and floors you have. And we can identify the contents that are in there and come up with estimates around its size. So if you're a moving company, you spend most of your time in this interface. And the cool part is everything you're seeing here was done without human involvement after the video got recorded. You can see the customer recorded a quick 13-second video. It identified all of the objects that are in that room and came up with a table showing what's there. We can estimate packing materials by looking at millions of different cases where a professional went and looked at this room and said, okay, I think I need so many small cartons, so many medium cartons. And then we summarize down that video into a few pictures and we make a nice visual report that we call the visual inventory. This was our August last month. So the map started on August 1st, totally blank, and every blue dot is someone who did a Yembo last month. You can see we're pretty heavy in the US and in Western Europe, but I think this kind of speaks to the scale of what AI allows people to do. This is a relatively obscure industry. It's not as maybe publicly known as self-driving cars or drones or some of these more like higher marketed industries. But we've found a way to kind of embed ourselves in the fundamental plumbing of how this infrastructure works. And the really cool part about it being cloud-hosted AI is this survey learns and makes the algorithm better. And then this one benefits it, this one benefits from it. So if I'm a human and I'm physically going into homes and writing down, okay, I see a whiteboard here, I see some chairs over there, I'll learn as I do this and I'll get better. But as time goes on, I'm only improving myself. And when you build these cloud AI models, your improvements can have a much wider effect and you can benefit a lot more people. So why does it feel like there's so much buzz around AI? It feels like every day you go in the news and there's some new tool. So I wanted to go and break down, does this just feel like things are moving faster or are they actually moving faster? So what I did was I found a list of the top 10 greatest hits of mankind's inventions. And I defined greatest hits by the number of people that are brought out of poverty. So if you look all the way back to modern agriculture, this wasn't just something that increased people's standards of living. It allowed people to survive through the winter. It's pretty profound. And then the wheel brought along with it commerce, where you could trade not with people just immediately in your village, but you could go down the street, you go to other towns, and it would expand the economy from there. And writing, education, go on down the list. But the interesting part is I did some engineering trickery on this chart, and this is not to scale. The last 3 points are a single human lifespan, and they make up less than 1% of the overall timeline. So what this means is if you were born around here, it didn't really matter, plus or minus 100 years or so, a day in your life would probably be pretty much the same. But if you were born in 1980 versus 90 versus 2000, things are profoundly different. And that speaks to the fact that it's not just feeling like things are going faster, things actually are moving quicker. The other way you can look at this is you can measure the impact of a product by how long it takes for that product to reach 100 million users. There's no one hard and fast rule on what critical mass is, but it's hard to argue that 100 million is insignificant. If you think about back when I was in school, Facebook was one of the first companies to do this in a lightning fast pace. It took about 4.5 years. That record didn't last very long. iPhone comes along, beats it by almost a year. Then not too long ago, if you remember the COVID pandemic with all the government subsidies that it took to get the COVID-19 vaccine out, Pfizer beats it in under a year. And this record lasted even less than Facebook. Remember this tool, you've probably heard of it once or twice, ChatGPT, 100 million in less than 2 months, which I think is really remarkable compared to, think of all of the efforts that governments around the world put into tilt to scales to make this 4 months, not 5, 6, 10, 12 or more. And then AI comes along and basically changes the world overnight. So there's one lesson. You don't learn anything else from this talk. I don't think AI is going to make any person obsolete. But if you bury your head in the sand, your inability to adapt to the new way of work might. Then AI, I don't think, is a panacea. It doesn't do everything perfectly or amazingly. And there are some things that it actually does horribly on. So I don't know if there are any Star Trek fans here, but Gene Roddenberry, he has a foundation. And he, I think he's passed on a while ago, but his foundation has a prize for furthering the advancement of science and technology in general is what it does. But they have a specific prize for what they call AI advancing good. And what this does is if you can come up with an algorithm that solves a certain set of problems, they will give you a $1 million prize if you're the first to do it and you give it away for free. So you can't just solve it. You have to show your training data. You have to show your code. You have to give it all away for the public good. And to solve it, you have to solve something that is currently unsolved in the space, right? It's not really meaningful if you just solve something that's been done before. So if you think about all the great and amazing things that AI can do, just imagine what can it not do? What would you want this to do? And the actual puzzle is really kind of embarrassingly simple. So here's the puzzle. Someone blocked me, but that's okay, I'll talk about it. So there are 3x3 grids, and each grid has a color on it. So there's 3 different shades. And if I show you these 3, and I transform them in some way, and then I'll let you think about it for a little bit, but what are you doing to the left-hand image to make it look like the right-hand image? I flew out here yesterday with my 4-year-old daughter, and she got it after looking at it for a while. Just for the sake of time, you rotated 180 degrees. But this is currently unsolved. You take the snapshot, you put it into ChatGPT, you'll get silly answers. And that's because the fundamental technology of what it's doing is it requires not just next token prediction like a large language model would need, but it needs visual reasoning and visual planning, which is just something that the state of the art hasn't really cracked the code on yet. So in some areas, AI is profoundly powerful, but in other areas that my 4-year-old daughter can take a look at, it's inadequate. So that leaves a really interesting and I'd say fertile environment for innovation for us, where the humans can partner with the AI. And I don't think the AI is going to take anybody's jobs away. But if you think of something incredible that a human could build, like a large building or a complex business or something along these lines, the building, you have a lot of buildings, Empire State Building down to a typical single family home. They start by digging a hole in the dirt. And then there's a lot of interesting things that you can do in fancy furnishings and the architecture, the design of the building. Is it going to be commercial? Is it going to be residential? What purpose does it serve? There's a lot of this creative work that I believe is uniquely human. But underneath that, you've got the scaffolding of this more routine work. And I'd encourage folks to focus on the areas over here. AI isn't going to make a decision that you have to stand behind for you, at least not in the foreseeable future that I see. But there's a lot of this work that is more routine or pattern-based, and that's where you should focus your AI on. And I think this is true when you're deploying new technology. I think it's true when you're deciding what company to work for, what startups to build. If you look at what Yembo does, we don't replace building rapport in the sales process. We replace counting cardboard boxes so that you can focus on these higher value activities. And I do believe this leaves a lot of work for humans still. It's still tough to innovate. It's usually, the deck is usually stacked against the innovator because there's a status quo that a lot of people weren't complaining about when you came along. If you think back to email versus snail mail, it's not enough to be a little bit better. You need to be 10 times better to get mass adoption. Think about Uber versus a cab. It's not okay to be 5% faster here or there. You need to fundamentally redefine these things, or you just don't get traction. And if you look at the case studies of how these technologies have taken off, there are uniquely human abilities that are required to pull that off. You need to communicate well to people with different backgrounds and different points of view, people you may not even agree with. You need to be able to motivate, to inspire, to persuade. And these are all things that AI could maybe help you as a person get better, but at the end of the day, a human's got to stand behind that decision and back it up and do all these things. So I'd say the future is a partnership between the humans and the AI, and that's where all the innovation is happening right now. Does anyone recognize this picture? Kind of weird and obscure, didn't expect it. This is the deepest hole that mankind has ever dug. You recognize it? Nice. Do you know where it is? It's in former Soviet Union, modern Russia. But when there was a space race going on, it wasn't really publicized as widely, but there was a race to the core of the Earth, or as low as we could possibly go. But the Russians, or the Soviets, then trounced the Americans. The Americans made it about 200-300 feet. Then there was another budget cut, and the project just kind of got shelved. The Soviets made it 40,000 feet deep. And they discovered a bunch of things that were unknown in geology at the time. So if you remember back to like grade school geology class, where you think of the Earth as this tiny little eggshell crust, and there's the big gooey mantle and the solid core, they discovered that way before you actually get to the mantle, that the granite in the crust actually behaves more like a fluid than a solid. And that's what stalled them out for 3 years, is they would dig down with this boring equipment. And as soon as they'd clear the space, the material around would fill in. And for 3 years, they made virtually no progress. And then, if you remember what happened in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. They found other things to do. And if you go there today, it's an interesting bit of bar trivia, but completely unremarkable. And I think it's a good visual reminder of what happens if you pursue technology for technology's sake. And if you don't connect it to some fundamental problem that you're solving, your AI initiatives, your projects that you work on, they can turn out like this. And that's why I put it up here and held it up for so long, is just don't have your project turn into this. But that leads me to my 10 reasons why I'm personally optimistic, and I think the opportunities that AI opens up for all of us. And this first one is really important. Most people, I think, overlook this, where if you read news or you talk to folks that are not in technology and ask them about AI, I don't think Hollywood helps, but people tend to gravitate towards Terminator or HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and they think about the AI being a faster, better, cheaper person. But I think the part that this overlooks is that if you look back in the American economy and globally as well, work isn't really zero sum. In a zero sum world, if I give one person a task, I've taken it away and off the market from everybody else, and there's only so much work to go around. But the consulting giant McKinsey did a study and found that in every decade since World War II in the US, 10% of the jobs that are employing people didn't exist in the decade prior. And that goes to show that work is not zero sum, and the nature of work may change, but the economy has been growing, more and more jobs are creating, and it's because work is not zero sum. So change doesn't mean that people are going to become obsolete, but the nature of what they're doing may change. The HR giant Workday did a study, and they found that they believe in the next 5 years, a typical white collar office worker will save about 1,000 hours a year thanks to AI. And a typical year is what, maybe 2,000 working hours or so, depending on vacation and time off and all those kinds of things. So this is pretty remarkable. I think even if they're 10x wrong and they overestimated it, it's still pretty phenomenal. And I think this opens up a lot of opportunities for folks, because this is why everyone's going crazy over AI, is if you could get 10%, 20%, 50% of your day back to focus on other areas, what is that going to free people up to do? Which leads me to number 2. And this is around personalization, is if you think about typical product that you use, how many apps you have on your phone, if you launch one, that experience, that process that you go through to watch a Netflix video or to order something on Amazon, they're pretty good, they're pretty convenient, but they're sort of designed kind of like a factory, where there's a certain amount of people coming through, they have this stage, they have the next stage. But if you think about what AI allows for, is you can personalize things and make it bespoke to each person. So if you are a visual learner and you're looking through a lot of information, you can get a lot of charts and graphs. And if you are more of an auditory learner, what if you could customize things and you could have narrations around the material that you're learning? You're still learning the same information in both cases, but you're able to custom tailor depending on your particular learning habits. And that's just one example, but the basic idea is that you don't have to have a one-size-fits-all solution anymore, that you can make things very custom tailored, and that opens up a lot of opportunities. So this is all well and good. Why are we not here now? Well, I found another study that looked at the reasons why AI initiatives have failed, or where something got started in a pilot phase, but for one reason or the other, the budgets got pulled afterwards and things didn't quite work out. And to a pessimist, this may look like a bunch of reasons why we're foolish to even try. But I feel like as an engineer and as an optimist, this is our punch list of what we need to solve to be able to get mass adoption. So tied at the top, disengaged employees and lack of incentives. So what is that telling us? It's telling us that humans have a strange relationship with change. On the surface, we like to talk about it, but practically we're kind of hardwired to avoid it. And this means that if you are an individual contributor at a company, you don't necessarily want to change because of the bottom line. A senior leader may care about that, but in terms of day-to-day work, you may face resistance. So that means that leadership needs to figure out what's really in it for each rank along the way. If you go down the list, concerns around whether the technology is mature enough, is the training data unbiased? Is the technology even possible to do the use cases we're bringing out? Are we training people correctly? Are we investing appropriately? So I think we've still got plenty of work to do. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, but these all seem to me like solvable problems. I spent a lot of time in the lab getting a tour earlier. A lot of problems I don't quite understand, but these I feel like relatively easier, right? Brings us to number 3. Number 3 is that I think Thomas Edison is attributed with this quote, but it's fuzzy if he actually said it or not, that genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. And if you think back to that routine versus creativity, AI is really good at that perspiration amount of work. You need to sift through a ream of data, pull out outliers, look at something to maybe flag for review in a bit more depth. And if you think about the nature of work, I don't know about all of you, I would rather focus on that 1%. It's more interesting, it's more invigorating, it's more fun, it's more productive. And that's the exact kind of work that we'll be able to do more of in the future. Think back to the last big decision that you made. Maybe it was which classes to take, or a job decision that you took or didn't take. But I think most decisions at the end of the day are usually pretty emotional. You can think through things and be rational about it, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of dependence on a trusted advisor or friend. And I think with AI, it's much easier to play through different scenarios, where at least a lot of the conventional wisdom when I was looking for a job was, oh, just try it. If you don't like it, always find another job. But that means you have to sort of jump off the proverbial cliff and see what happens. But with AI, if you're able to kind of simulate a tough conversation, run through different scenarios, ask about pros and cons, you can learn and benefit from going through that experience without having to actually do it. I gave a similar talk a couple of weeks ago at the Project Management Institute. So they're the organization that gives the PMP, Project Management Professional Certification. And they had a really interesting point where they said, if you're at a larger company, whether there's someone there who worked on railroad lines, and she was telling me in her 20 or so years working there, all projects, when they go and have problems, they have the same kinds of problems. They go over budget, they have unplanned problems that come up, they have personnel issues. So being able to kind of like query the corpus of projects that have happened in the past and say, I'm fundraising for my startup idea, here's my proposed budget, what am I missing? AI is gonna be really good at giving you those examples. Again, it won't tell you what should I work on, because it's all trained on what's been done in the past as opposed to what's happening in the future. But if you wanna look at, kick the tires on this idea a little bit, it's much easier to do. And there are universities and a lot of different research bodies that are trying to make it easier to make good decisions with AI. I feel like AI is sort of held to a higher standard than human decisions, where if an AI is biased, it seems to make the news overnight and people revolt against it, they won't touch it again. But if a human makes a biased decision, then people, oh, we're all human after all anyway, right? So MIT put together this risk database. And if you Google it, if you're interested, you can look up MIT risk database. And they have enumerated all of the possible things that are likely to go wrong if you kick off an AI initiative. Everything from governance failure to it going rogue to centralizing power and what it does to the economy afterwards. And I don't know as many human decision-making matrices that have gone through this level of scrutiny. So if you're looking at starting an initiative, you can already go and query with a lot of really smart people with a lot of funding behind it, can go and tell you what are things that are likely to go wrong in that scenario. And it's all neatly organized if you actually go to their database, and they can help you kind of put the safeguards in before it's too late, before something crazy has happened. I wish I had this for like everything beforehand, but it only came out last year. For being honest around the nature of work, a lot of the habits that we have really needed to be changed anyway. If you think about AI as an accelerator of what's already there, I think that's sort of a reductive view, but AI gives you the ability to think through new workflows and new scenarios. And after this, I'm heading out to London. I'm giving a talk at a executive assistant professional association. And they are, if you think about that profession, it's really interesting right now where they're sort of trying to decide how they feel about AI. Because on one hand, there's sort of the sense that it's inevitable and powerful and everyone's going to use it. But on the other hand, if all the executives have a ChatGPT style assistant, what is the future for the executive assistant? And one of the other speakers I'm on a panel with, she has this point of view that it's going to change the profession to be more of like a chief administration officer, where the booking of the hotels and the scheduling and all those kind of important day-to-day tasks will still get done. But this person that now has kind of visibility into the entire business of what's working and what's not working can have a job title change. I think this is really remarkable because it's allowing us to not just take AI and replace what we had been doing before, but kind of rethink the new ways of work and redefine things. And if something wasn't working so great, well, the technology is sort of developed and presented to all these industries at once without comment, and everyone kind of has to grapple with for themselves what works and what doesn't work, which is a little bit terrifying, but also really empowering because nobody has this all figured out yet. But I think the worst thing you can do is sit on the sidelines and wait for someone else to figure it out. The best thing is you can look at these habits that needed revisiting anyway. This one, pretty quick. AI does a great job in the areas where humans struggle. You think about when the spreadsheet was first invented, this was kind of a similar parallel, is spreadsheets are credited with a lot of benefit in terms of economic growth. And if you look at when, I think it was Lotus Notes that first came out with it, and you looked at what the US economy was doing, you don't have to torture the logic too much to say that the ability to allow the computer to do what it was good at and let the person kind of govern it or co-pilot it, it did a lot of good for folks. And I think if you look at AI, you're seeing a lot of these things repeating or at least rhyming. The flip side of the way to look at this is too that AI can fill a need where the alternative is to not do anything. And I think this is another part that people overlook when they think of AI as an accelerator for what's already here. If you think about a lot of the world that we live in, this classroom even, there's generally one instructor for 20 to 30 different students. You go and talk to a therapist, there's a cost, usually in hundreds of dollars or so, because that person's time is valuable and they could be serving other patients. But what happens in these scarce use cases when the system doesn't work for somebody? So if I'm a visual learner and my professor loves to lecture, I may conclude that this material is just not for me and I have to just go study something else. But going back to that idea of personalization, if everybody had an infinitely patient tutor that knew each person's learning abilities, what they were good at, what they were not good at, you'd be able to have a much more well-rounded education. And if you think about speaking to a therapist, what if you didn't have to wait in line? What if you didn't have to pay hundreds of dollars an hour? And sure, there are technical barriers that maybe make every use case not possible today. But if you think about it in terms of not what's being done and how can I do it faster with AI, but what am I not even getting the chance to do? I think those are a lot of white space for new and interesting ideas. In our industry in Yembo, we had one customer who, obviously the value prop, you can do things faster, you can survey quicker, but they realized they were doing a bunch of moves where the return trip, the truck was coming back empty. So they'd move someone maybe New York to San Francisco, and then that move's done and they drive an empty truck back and pick up the next job. And then they realized, hey, with Yembo, I can centralize the sales process and I can go bid on Google Ads and find someone in San Francisco who's trying to move back to New York. And I can actually increase my top and bottom line by not having my truck ship air half the time. It's a brilliant, brilliant use case that is not just looking at how can AI take what I'm already doing and shrink down the time, but what are the new opportunities that are opened up by this? And I think maybe not as headline grabbing, but it's certainly impactful to companies' top and bottom line. And I think one of the good implementations of this is this concept called baseline proficiency. And baseline proficiency works this way. If you look at most tasks in business, they don't generally need a world-class expert to be capable of getting that job done. I mean, you usually have to have an area that you're like 10 out of 10 amazing at, but a lot of the day-to-day, what it makes to be like a productive employee, you just need to be proficient. So to give an example, I was a couple months ago now, we had a very strange problem that doesn't usually happen in software engineering, but we were early and under budget on one of our projects that we had done. Very strange, I know it doesn't happen often. And the problem that this opened up is at the end of the development process, we usually hand over what we had just built to our design team, and they'll shoot a demo video and basically give material that we can use to go to market and explain. You can't physically touch Yembo, so we have to show example videos around, here's how it works, here's what you can do with it, here's where you can learn more information. And the design team was backlogged because they had their previous project, they weren't done yet. So what happened was we had a decision to make. Either we say, okay, we just wait, and when they get around to it, when they had kind of initially planned a couple months down the road, that's when we do it. Or is someone at the company going to be enterprising and become baseline proficient and learn, again, not how to be a Hollywood expert, but how do you make a demo video and bring that time to market effectively a couple months earlier. As an AI company, I think you can guess which one we ended up doing, but I think the way that we went about it, I thought was really revealing. So first, we told our lead designer, who generally does this videography, what we wanted to do. We ripped the Band-Aid off, let the shock fall that we're going to try to do it without her. And she sits and says, Zach, you're not an expert at this. You don't even have a good eye for it. So it's not just training, but I see where you're coming from. I'm not going to stop you. So here's what we're going to do. And she gave me YouTube videos around camera positioning, lighting, audio, how you muffle the sound with pillows so you don't hear weird echoes, and all these practical things that you could do. And you're not going to go and win any Academy Awards or anything, but you will not embarrass yourself. The problem, though, is the shoot was scheduled for about 5 days from then, and I think she gave me about 8 or 9 hours of video I was supposed to watch. So I used Mac Whisper. It's the Mac app around the ChatGPT or OpenAI's Whisper transcription. I transcribed all her videos. I asked ChatGPT to summarize it into bullet points. I put in the Notes app on my phone. So there was a section called lighting, a section called camera angles, section called sound. And when we got there on the set, we had a couple folks from our team who were standing in as actors, and I was running around behind the camera. And I wasn't amazing at it. I mean, I probably made a lot of errors along the way. But when it came time to go set up the cameras, I went and I was proficient enough. And I think that ability to venture out of your comfort zone, acknowledge, hey, I'm not really an expert in this, but the alternative is to do nothing. I think that's really empowering. And I think we're going to see more of that. And if you look at all these different tools that are coming out, AI video editing, image editing, all of these things are taking this kind of niche, esoteric kind of knowledge. And it's not replacing what the people who are skilled at that will do, but it's completely unavailable to a lot of the market. And this is going to make it more available. And I think that will actually help these professions because the need for it will increase because more people are getting their foot in the door. So I think it's this concept of being baseline proficient. And all it takes is just allowing yourself to maybe not be 10 out of 10 in it. But again, the alternative is nothing. So you're no worse off if you do that. AI reduces information overload. I think we've all seen this. I don't know how many apps people have on their phone. I feel like every couple of months I'm like calling it back and deleting different things. It was almost easy when I was in school to build a new app because everything was getting digitized for the first time. You take this paper-based process and the value prop list, it's in the cloud. You don't have to remember your paper, you don't have to file it away. But now we have a secondary problem, which is there's just too much information where people don't want to log in anymore and have a dashboard of 20 different charts. So you want to be told, what do I need to know and when do I need to know it? And I think there's a lot of opportunity here because a lot of companies, hospitals, research organizations, they're sitting on tons of data and most people just collect it because that's how the process works. The app doesn't work unless you do that, but they don't really know what to do with it. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I believe probably most people don't realize the value of the data that they're sitting on. Does anyone here own Reddit stock? Curious. You're doing everything. I promise I didn't plant them. I didn't tell them before. But so Reddit went public earlier this year, and in their S1 filing, they mentioned that they had made about $250 million licensing their data to companies that train large language models. I think it's a brilliant example that you can create a new business model from AI. The actual AI didn't immediately facilitate that transaction. It's not like an AI use case or an AI practical application, but they realized that they were sitting on something that was of value to people building AI. And that data, they didn't have to build it, they already had it. I think it's a brilliant idea in terms of how do you allow other companies to go and do things further and be more productive with their day. So if AI is all filled with hype, I'm going to show you some charts that you're going to have a hard time backing up. So we face this a lot. I think Emily and I saw a customer a couple of weeks ago that still uses a typewriter for writing their estimates. So they weren't competing against another piece of technology. They just said, yeah, I know it's not efficient, but this is the way that I do things. And we hear this a lot where pushback around, hey, is AI really, is it really practical or are you just chasing the next shiny thing? So PwC, the big accounting giant, did this study where they took a global group of CEOs and divided them into two camps. In the first camp, they call it adopted. These were the folks that had kicked off at least one generative AI initiative. It only was focusing on generative AI. I think it's true of AI in general, but this one was just on Gen AI. And the other camp was aware of it, but hadn't done any practical steps. They hadn't deployed anything. They hadn't bought any tools, anything along those lines. And they went and they asked a bunch of questions to these different people groups. And they asked them, here's the statement. And they noted down what % of people agreed in each of the camps. So my company has changed its technology strategy because of AI. 70% of the adopters said yes. Only 10% of the non-adopters said yes. And you could take it bias sampling, whatever. And if you go on to like the next one, the pattern repeats over and over again. Gen AI will improve the quality of my company's products and services. This is one that tells you it's not all hype. Because if it was all hype, the people who would have tried it would have not said 89% of the time it's going to change things. They would have tried it, they said, yeah, it's not for me, and then move on to something else. And the interesting part, if you go through the study, chart after chart after chart looks the same. Enhance my ability to build trust. Significantly changes the way my company creates value. You get the point, but every single one of them is overwhelmingly in favor. So the authors of the study said that adopting really is believing, that it's hard to read a white paper and in the abstract understand all the little nuances, all the things that can go wrong. But if you just go ahead and try and take that first step, then more likely than not, you will walk out finding some application where you believe it's beneficial to your company's top and bottom line. It will also make the industry more competitive, and folks feel like they're not adequately trained overall. So I think those are two glimpses of opportunities for maybe startups or other new initiatives where you'll be able to solve these problems. These are global CEOs. These are the kinds of things that everybody's kind of concerned about all at once. And that's that. So number 9, AI frees up drudgery so that the humans can focus on higher value activities. We talked about this from a slightly different angle before, but there's a study that Microsoft did a couple months ago that I thought illustrated this point very well. Has anyone here worked with batteries? There's a lot of power systems folks in here. Has anyone ever seen what happens when you poke a hole in a lithium battery? Probably everyone. Combusts. So naturally, this is not a desirable property of batteries, especially when we carry them all in our pockets every day. So Microsoft was teaming up with, I forget what university, but they wanted to find a more stable battery. So that problem did happen, that you don't have, they have the funny term, I think it's called thermal runaway, which is basically just, it blows up, but it's the official technical term for it. And if you look at a battery, I'm a software guy, so I might totally butcher this. So feel free to chime in if you're a chemistry buff and you know more than I do. But I know there's a cathode and an anode, and you need some material that divides the two so you don't have a short. And when you puncture, the air to oxygen touching the lithium is, I guess, what creates issues. And they were looking for other chemical compounds you could put in this battery so that if that happened, you would basically hold back the flames and not have it erupt. So they researched all these different properties around what chemical compounds could have those properties to be able to not react violently like the current batteries do. And they did the math, they found something around 30 million or so different potential chemical compounds. Well, I don't know how many graduate students you would need to sift through that list and find what the actual ones were. So they trained an AI algorithm on evaluating it. And it wasn't perfect, it probably made some mistakes, but it ran for about 40, 50 hours or so. And at the end of it all, it spit out, I think it was about 20 possible ones. And then the researchers looked at it and actually synthesized one of them in a lab. So for, again, obscure corner of the world, most people probably didn't even know this happened. AI has invented a chemical compound now. And they built a working prototype, and I don't know what they're doing with it next, but basically that initial step compressed all these years of research that it would have taken. So the humans are still involved, the humans are still calling the shots, the humans are way more powerful as a result of having this technology. So how do you kick off AI? What do you do with it? I think there's 4 main buckets. If you have an idea you're kicking around, if you're maybe thinking of joining a startup and a CEO is trying to hound you on the phone with a startup concept, I think there are a lot of things that you can do, but if you want to get started, I think there's 4 main areas around evaluating, is this a good AI workflow? Step 1 is identifying the value proposition. There's a lot of eye candy out there, a lot of noise, but I would say a genuinely valuable AI tool has a good value prop. There are 3 common ones. I don't think this is exhaustive, but 3 common ones that we've seen. It'll save you time, it'll reduce your errors, it'll improve your user experience. You think about self-driving cars, it'll improve your user experience. You don't have to spend your time staring at the road. ChatGPT, similar use case. The actual fundamental technology had been around a while, but that chat interface, that you can talk to it just like you talk to a person, that was the real novel invention. Everybody has constraints. What's scarce in the market that you're serving? Are you time scarce, budget scarce, people scarce, or maybe all of the above? And understanding what those constraints are. We did a study with our customers and we found that we really need to see adoption in the first 30 days. Otherwise, it's really hard to get someone who got excited, signed up, and then didn't use the tool. So we have a relatively short expected time to value. If you think about self-driving cars that Elon Musk promised us in 2018, it's a much longer time to value. People seem to be more patient, and those intermediate steps along the way are still valuable. So thinking through those things and not trying to bite off an open-ended research project in a scenario where you're expected to deliver in the first 30 days is really powerful. There will likely be a learning curve. I feel like people have higher and higher standards that they hold software to, and it's not really fair. In the 90s, it was okay to buy a piece of software. It's usually shrink wrapped in a big box on the store, maybe CompUSA or Circuit City or something, and they'd have manuals, and you'd be expected to go read the manual and learn how the software works before you go live. And then somewhere along the way, we got more impatient. I think user interfaces got better, experience design became a profession, and there was an expectation that you wouldn't have to read manuals anymore. But I think with these AI use cases, their value is there. If you can really get 1,000 years back, it's worth spending 100 or so in investing in workflows and training and all these things. So it's okay to train for a valuable workflow. The key is the value has to be there. But I think planning on iterating and understanding what that critical path is that must work right and nailing that and making sure that you don't have mistakes along the way. I shared our Yembo interface earlier in the talk. The AI does occasionally make mistakes. People like to talk about them more. You show a room that has like 90 items detected correctly, people talk about the 2 that don't. But if you look at that interface, nobody dies if you get it wrong. We made it really easy, really visual. You can click on it, you can change it, and the value prop is still there. I didn't have to drive out. I don't have to watch all these videos, and I'm still getting value even if it's not perfect. That's a good example of nailing that critical path workflow. It's understanding what is the customer you're trying to serve, what are their needs, and make sure that 10 times out of 10, if they go at bat, they get their problem solved. And then lastly, a lot of folks seem to skip over this, but look at the maturity of the tool that you're evaluating, the maturity of the industry that you're in. If you are working in compliance, you may be subject to compliance requirements yourself. If you launch in the EU, you may have to deal with GDPR. I think we were live in the US for 6 years before we got our first email requesting that someone delete their data. We launched in Germany on Monday, and Tuesday I got my first email, hey, please delete my data. So depending on where you're launching or where you're marketing it, these things either matter profoundly or they don't. Another big thing that people are talking about now, I've get a lot of pitches each week from different vendors that want to sell me stuff. But this idea around hosting the data is there's a really sneaky maneuver if you look at a lot of these AI tools, where if you go to a typical software pricing page, there's usually like 3 or 4 plans. There's like the cheap beginner plan, the medium plan that they always want you to do. There's like usually a big bright red button on that one, and the super expensive one that says call us. Has anyone seen this before? Well, if you see a lot of these AI tools, the basic plan is ridiculously cheap. It's not like $2 a month less, it's like 10% the cost. But if you read the fine print, they'll train the models on your data on this plan, but they won't on the next one up. And for some use cases, maybe that's fine. For other use cases, it might be a non-starter. So if you're working at a company and you're looking at kicking something off, like maybe not the most fun thing to do, but do read the fine print. There are AI tools maybe help you analyze those things. And then understanding what are the parameters of the world that I'm working in, and thinking through that maturity, I think is a good way to help. My 10th point is my favorite one. We saw Reddit do it with their licensing of their data set, but AI allows for economic value to be tied to the output of what was created, not the effort that was put in. So this, I would say, is tearing away the basic way that we built the economy in the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution kind of moved us away from these individual traders to time for dollars. So you come into the shop, you have an hourly rate, you do 8 hours of work, you get 8 hours of pay. That is tied to the effort that you're putting in. But what AI allows for is you might be able to make something super valuable that didn't take a bunch of effort but has a lot of output. So I have one example that I'll share next and we'll wrap up. But I wrote my first book last year called Grow Up Fast, Lessons from an AI Startup. I had to fit it in a checked luggage. I have 3 I can give away, but if you want more, I can hook you up afterwards. And shortly after doing this, we got feedback from people that they wanted to have an audiobook. So I had never done an audiobook before, but that whole concept of baseline proficiency, I went and looked into what it would take. And I was fortunate enough, I had a colleague at my company who used to be a professional actress before she became a software engineer. So I asked her, hey, have you ever narrated an audiobook before? And she hadn't, but she knew enough about how to do it. So we again, Googled, we asked ChatGPT, and we rented a studio in Los Angeles. And I learned a lot of things about the audiobook process. I learned you're never supposed to record more than 4 hours at once because your vocal cords naturally get tired. And that'll show up in the recording. You'll be able to tell. So this project It's not a super long book, it's maybe 200-ish pages, but it took about 5 weeks because we had day jobs, we only worked on Saturdays, and we could only do 4 hours at a time. And then after we finished, Yembo is a global company. You saw the blue dots all over the map. I got requests from a customer in Germany. I had a couple of different clients in other offices, employees in other countries. And we started getting requests for audiobooks in other languages, in languages that I don't speak. And I was inclined to just kind of ignore it. I mean, I'm busy, I got other things to do, but I was curious around this idea of these new economic models. So I asked the employee, hey, can I buy a license to your voice? And I want to train an AI and clone. I've got 5 hours of studio grade audio of you speaking. And I'd love to, with your permission, clone your voice and then take a human translated audiobook in a different language and then synthesize it. So that 5 weeks of being in the studio, I want to turn that into a software problem. And this made the front page of the San Diego business or San Diego Union Tribune's business section when we launched it. And they weren't really interested in the book itself, which offended my ego, but that's okay. They were really excited on the business model. And they actually had a contract attorney look at the terms, and basically they were debating whether or not it was going to be good for the economy or bad for the economy. And then it got a little awkward. The anti-crowd started adding me on LinkedIn. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to talk about it. But I think the general consensus, and draw your own conclusions, but I think generally, at least in my world, it wasn't taking a job away. I just wouldn't have done it otherwise. And I was really impressed. I have a quick, about 45-second video clip. And what you'll see is the English narration is the studio grade audio of the narrator in Los Angeles. Every other language is AI. And she fooled her husband. She played it for him, and he thought she had been taking Japanese lessons. I'll go ahead and I'll play it.
Slamming down on the desk in frustration. My co-founder glanced over his shoulder at me and flipped on his headphones so he could continue his work in peace. I had been active for a few weeks and hadn't shown much progress yet. これは製品開発ではなく、証明を検討し続けるためだけにリソースを割り当てなければならない。我的联合创始人从肩膀上扭过头来，看了我一眼，然后迅速戴好耳机，继续安心工作。我已经在这个项目上工作了好几周，可是并没有取得多大进展。Akıl sağlığından endişe etmeye başladım. Ürünün ilk sürümünü birkaç ay önce başarıyla devreye aldım. Місті в засновник подивився на мене через плече і вдягнув навушники, щоб спокійно продовжити свою роботу. Jag hade sysslat med det här i några veckor. Ci stavo lavorando da qualche settimana, notava flittiga vajfullkommen. Men detta sen kopplade på ympade behov och sentimental, passade praktiken. Tínhamos implementado com sucesso a nossa primeira versão funcional do jogo alguns meses.
Two people with day jobs who had never done it before. Again, probably said some things a little bit funky, probably wasn't 100% perfect, but the alternative was to do nothing. And now in the business arrangement, she gets to collect a royalty on the book sales. I think this is what's really a big deal for her, is she didn't have to go back to the studio and record again. She didn't have to, on paper, I guess, do any more work. But as a professionally trained actress, she had spent time and resources basically making her voice an asset that people would want to listen to. She had to stand on stage and do auditions and things along these lines. And this allows her to get economic incentive or output from giving something of value, even though she did the work once and then monetized it multiple times. And I'm not allowed to use it for anything apart from this book, but I'm really tempted to. I have to log in. I gave her the password as well. And she's smart. What she did is she said, I'm going to ask you to upload your own voice, this whole like detente idea, that if you do anything silly in my voice, I can do the same silly thing in your voice. And that's kept me at bay. I haven't done anything weird yet. So I think at the end of it all, AI effectively magnifies people. It doesn't replace them. It's on you to figure out all these details around how does it work and where do I use it. But I think the worst thing that can be done is to ignore it and let everyone else in the profession figure it all out for us. So that wraps up why I'm all here today. Thank you so much for taking the time. Happy to stand around and answer any questions that come up. But these are my 10 reasons in a nutshell. Thank you.
Just the point there, did you, one of your tools do that, or did you subcontract that to it?
We used a tool called 11 Labs. It's commercially available. They didn't pay me to say it, but there were a couple of that didn't work so well. That one, it's I think it's $20 a month. You get basically a quota of how many words you can use. And we needed the audiobook size one, so we bought a $99 a month one. So I think all of that said and done was maybe $300-400, and we had all these different languages.
It learned her phonetics from the reading of the book.
Correct.
Made a robot and then applied the structure of the other languages to it.
Exactly.
And,
yeah. So,
and synthesized the phonetics of those languages. It sounds like her.
Exactly. Yeah. So they have. Yeah, this isn't my area of expertise. I'll try not to butcher it, but there's a concept of a phoneme, just sort of like a syllable, and certain languages have ones that other ones don't. So if you speak like a Romance language, they're all generally similar, but if you go to like Mandarin or Japanese, they're different. So it'll take all these examples and learn each of those phonemes, and then the interface looks like Google Docs. You take your transcript, you paste it in, and then you click the play button, it plays that sentence. You can go and proofread along the way. And it turned it into, it felt like editing. As you're looking at it, you play it back. We had a couple of folks who like listened to it and gave feedback to make sure we're on the right path. Sometimes you have to, they have a way you can mention intonation and inflection. They have like a vocabulary where you can do those kinds of things. So it occasionally did some things like that. But I think overall, I guess she had been doing Duolingo, and she told her husband, hey, look, I'm awesome at French now. And he bought it at least for 5 minutes. So that was cool.
English was the slowest language.
The slowest?
It was the slowest.
Yeah, you can control the speed. I was just being impatient. I picked it all up, picked up the pace. But I think overall, I was just, I went from like shocked that it was possible to skeptical. And then I made a couple of snippets and we were sending it to people who were fluent and they gave feedback. And then we realized, okay, this is cool enough to do. And the funny part was the journalist was actually in touch with me for covering just the book in general. And then she had some last minute business travel come up. The article ended up not airing. And I guess the worst thing you can do in the publishing industry is ship old news. So when she came back, she said, okay, I'm sorry. It's an interesting story, but it's been out a month. I can't cover this anymore. So then I mentioned this, and she said she would check with the contracts people to see if it was interesting. And like, I think 6 hours later, they emailed back and said, how quickly can you come down? Can we see the contract? Can we do all these things? So that was kind of interesting. And I'm not even, I would say realistic, I'm not that remarkable in that space. I'm not a publisher. There are so many more problems that someone in that industry is probably privy to. And it's just, I think, more of a testament to how much opportunity is out there now than how awesome I am as a practitioner or whatever. I think there's just so many things right now. It feels kind of like the internet in the 90s, where no one really knows all of the different use cases, but everyone's kind of experimenting and seeing what works. Yes. Lots of them. Emily and I probably talked to you for hours. I would say the first one is, once you get over the hump, people think that you're full of baloney because they've been doing things 30, 40 years and you're coming in and say, hey, I can do this. They say, no, you can't. And then most people go away and say, come back when you have like some XYZ feature set. But we got that initial group of people that were willing to give it a shot. And a typical house, if you made like a histogram of all the items that people own, there's like, I think 300 items that are about 95% of what people own. Like everyone's got a coffee table and a TV, and like bronze statues and bird baths, relatively fewer have. So when we first launched, we could do 10 out of that 300 or so. And what we did was, hey, we sold the value not on AI will replace the work, but AI will speed it up a little bit. You don't have to drive out there, but people hear what they want to hear, and you give them that interface, and it was really easy to correct things, but they still just kind of expected, oh, this is silly because they called a small carpet a medium carpet. You know, dude, I got like how many things right, and that's the one thing I'll talk about. We had one person who got so carried away with the idea that it was AI that they sent it to a client who had already disconnected power. So we got all these videos of just plain black, and they were saying, oh, well, I thought the AI could just detect, hey, it's not magic. If you can't see it in the video, it's not going to be able to see it. But it's really incumbent on the practitioner to explain how, like, you don't have to explain the details of how it works, but how to use it and how to think about it. Because to a layperson, it's not really clear if they're asking for something, if it's already done, not done but possible, or like fantasy will never get there. So it's sort of incumbent on you to explain it in a way that they understand. And I feel like it took us, I don't know, like 3-4 years to get good at that. Yeah.
For the earlier slide you had shown, to get to that page, you have like two main models, the recognition model, and then you talk about the estimated packages that you need.
Yeah, there are actually three. So we have electrical engineering group. We can nerd out a bit. So you get a video, and we will detect all the objects in that video. But what's really important is not just all the detections, but I want to know how many chairs are there. So we have to track those over space in time and actually count the items. So number one is detector, two is tracker. Yeah, so those are two separate algorithms. There's detection, and then we have to track. And then the third one, it's not so much vision based as it's heuristics, where if I saw a book, this many bookshelves, this many, I think, cupboards and kitchens, there's a lot of things that if you see, you don't actually add to the inventory, but you had cartons for it. And for that, we just didn't do anything at first. We let movers add it in, and when we got about 100,000 samples, then we started automatically adding it, let people tweak it and all those kinds of things. But I think the cool part is, at the end of the day, the customers want the problem solved. I know as an academic, it can be tough to not have like one beautiful model that solves all problems. But under the hood, there's like 4 or 5 different things that you can do that solve the problem. As long as they log in, they have their work done. This like mixture of experts concept, it's basically fine. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Engineers love asking me this question, and I always disappoint them. The moving industry has this standard. It's called the cube factor, a factor of 7. And if you are thinking in an international context, you have a shipping container filled with household goods, generally the weight is a factor of 7 from the volume. So if you have a 40 cube shipping container, 7 pounds is 1 cubic foot, and it's accurate to what it needs to be. So generally people aren't mailing packages by scanning a picture. If you have a cardboard box, you can't tell, is it lead, is it feathers? But overall, as long as the shipment weight is accurate, at least in the US, that's what they're graded on, is the truck will go to the weigh station, look at the ticket, and they generally have plus or minus 10% tolerance is what the industry handles. So as long as you're within that, it's fine. And we have a way where after the shipment is done, people can punch in their scale weights and we can pull those down and kind of calibrate. And then internationally, people generally price on volume, not by weight. So there it's a little bit different, but basically it's just super fine grained classification, and then making sure that the volumes and the weights are representative. And if you're getting a bunch of variation at the sign, you need to split your classes and then go finer grain. So I think just having chairs, we have maybe 24 different kinds of chairs. We have office chair, children's chair, plastic chair, dining chair, and all those have slightly different volumes and weights. Yeah.
As a software developer, I feel like most software developers wouldn't know that's very lenient. How do you stop yourself from trying to think ahead of time? You need to know the exact way. But in reality, there is this, 10%, like most
So let me tell you how I learned it. I didn't know this going in. My wife was working at a moving company, so that's how I knew about the industry, but she was in a different department. It was more international and much more downstream. So I needed to learn from that person who knows that. And as you can imagine, if you call a moving company and say, hey, I'm doing market research, I might quit my job and do a startup one day, you get hung up 10 times out of 10. So I did that. And then I just found someone. I started looking at when their busy seasons are, and I called them in the off season. So generally people move in the summer. I called in the winter. And I didn't ask to pick his brain of a million questions. I said, I have a 6-pack of beer and I'd love to come by your office Friday at 4. Can I just ask you a couple questions then? And he agreed, because he told me the specific brand. He said, if you come with this 6-pack from this brewery, I'll give you 30 minutes. And then we ended up chatting for about 2 hours or so. And I think the thing that I learned from it is you don't have to know these things as an engineer. You have to know where to get it. And I still get on customer calls, probably 2 to 3 a week, and just hear feedback from people, pitch ideas off of them. I've been actually really surprised at how generous a lot of clients can be with their time. In the early days, we didn't get this so much. There's more resistance around, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job so you can charge me. I mean, it's like kind of a delicate balance you need to ask. But if you're already providing value and you're looking at what to do next, there's a certain type of person that likes being in that driver's seat. This idea of like a customer advisory board, or I mean, it's like borderline bribery to buying beers. I think learning from people that know and being humble and asking the right questions is more important, because that scales. Where if you go and study and learn everything, you'll run into something you don't know. So getting good at learning, I think, is more of the important part.
So, I'm very interested in you talking about this as a startup. What was like the decision point when you knew, I don't have just like an interesting idea or just an interesting technology or this, you realize, how do you decide this is a startup? This is a
I think it was gradual. So what I did was I was worried about NDAs and big corporate stuff. So I quit my job without having it all worked out, which in hindsight was kind of risky. But I was taking on consulting projects to kind of pay the bills in the interim time. So I think I had the benefit of not being incredibly rushed. It was an idea. I knew with the consulting work, like, it's always easy if you didn't burn any bridges. You always get hired back if it doesn't work out. And then basically became an engineering problem. Is if this is going to work in the time frame that I need it to work at, I can't afford to make like a neural link where it may take like decades for it to work out. But in like 2 to 3 years, it'd be good if this was up and running. So we did this concept called a letter of intent. So they're non-binding legal documents. And it's basically a fake negotiation where the company says, if you're able to deliver such and such a feature set and I can do X, Y, Z things, I'd be willing to pay X dollars a pop for it. And we probably got 2 dozen of those. And then disappeared for a year, basically worked on it part-time, and then went back when we had it and said, hey, I don't know if you remember me. A lot of people said, I thought you died. I don't know what happened. So you kind of like, I love that where you email back on a thread that's like over a year old, which, hey, remember me? And a couple of them kicked it off. And what it really came down to was we had one that it was a pretty big company, and they wanted to deploy it, but they wanted us to develop a few more things. So they gave a statement of work with like 30, 60, 90-day deliverables. We owned all the IP. It was a great deal for us. And I had no team, and I was working 10 hours a week on it. So I went to one of our board members, who was informally advising at the time. And I was like, I've never done this startup thing before. I think I need to raise now. And he said, Zach, you needed to raise like 2 months ago. Like this is way too late. You have the timer ticking. And that was kind of launched it all off. But I think in hindsight, I waited to like a little bit past the last possible minute, but you can do things that kind of de-risk it along the way, which I think is the important part. Is you don't have to just, people think of Mark Zuckerberg around like, have an idea, just do it and see what happens. It's a very capital inefficient and time inefficient way to test. But I think there are things that you can do to kind of test it all out beforehand. I have a friend who actually, he has a consumer physical good company, and he was looking at launching a new product. So he made a Shopify page for it, had 3D renders, bought Google Ads, and was basically, if you actually put in your credit card number, it would wait 24 hours and say, sorry, we're out of stock, you've been refunded. He did market research that way. And he intentionally picked like zip codes they didn't really care about, and he wasn't gonna tick off anyone like in his market. And they decided to pick one and not pick another based on that. It's like, I think he wasted $200 in Google ad dollars and basically de-risk his business. It's like, for the 20 people or so he annoyed, maybe it's not great, but from a business standpoint, it's pretty scrappy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, it's an important point. I don't think this was all encompassing. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I see them as problems to be solved. When Photoshop came out, we had similar issues too. And I remember when I was at 10 or 11, the Star Wars prequels came out, and my brother and I made pictures of ourselves with lightsabers, and we printed it on the 4x6 paper. And my grandma just couldn't wrap her head around the fact when I told her this wasn't real. I didn't actually, she's like, those laser swords, I didn't even know you can even buy them. Like, you can't, I have a stick. But the perception takes a while to change. And I think these are, by and large, at least in the States, it's being left to the companies to decide what they will and won't do. And I think a lot of them are trying to play it safe, naturally so, because once there's bad press, it's hard to wind that back. I mean, Facebook had to change their brand name after bad press. So I think that those are legitimate problems and real problems. And if we don't solve them, there's probably use cases that'll never really get AI. But I mean, this is what we do as engineers, right? We identify them, we break it down, we put in safeguards, we iterate, don't always get it right. But I think it's not a sign that you should give up. It's a sign that you should identify the problem and solve it. And like what 11 Labs does, you have to hold up your driver's license on a Zoom call, prove that you're you, and then they'll give you a script, you have to say it. So I couldn't have just taken her voice and behind her back plugged it in. Like she actually had to, like, there's no rule that says you need to do that. But I think those are the kinds of safeguards that you need to have. Otherwise, people will be skeptical, and for good reasons, right? Like nobody wants to live in a world where they're being accused of things they didn't do. It's like Salem witch trials all over again. Don't do that. Yeah. Mhm. Sure. I think it comes down to having an awesome value prop, not just for the company, but for every little feature that you add. We actually had one that we did a really good job at that we shelved, and that was if you take a layperson like me and you give me a bunch of furniture and you say pack the truck, we make these 3D models, we have all these size estimates. It's like not a far cry to say, hey, I could tell you how to pack that on the truck. But what we learned was the packers who are actually loading on move day are really good at that. They've been doing it 30, 40 years, and they don't really want to be told by a sheet of paper what they should and shouldn't do. So we had mathematical models that showed, hey, you can pack this much more on. And it was one of those things that we talked about it earlier. It probably wasn't 10 times better. It was like 10% better. And it basically, the idea never really took off. So fortunately, we didn't sink too much time into it, but we learned that that adoption curve is key. And if you're telling a sales leader who's commission-based, hey, you can close 3 times as many jobs in a day, that's a really powerful value prop that resonates. But if you tell a packer, hey, I'm a software engineer who's never actually loaded a truck a day in my life, here's how you should do your job, much tougher.
That
Yeah.
first video you showed with that room,
Mhm.
do you have to give it a reference measurement?
We don't. And it took 4 years. We have a team of 5 PhD researchers to get to that point. And the way we do it is we trained on reference measurements. So even if your phone, you don't have the Pro phone that doesn't have the LiDAR depth sensor, we have enough training data that we can basically infer what that sensor would have said. And for the use cases that we're after, we're doing things like buying drywall. It doesn't have to be like down to the millimeter. Those things are okay. So if you tap 2 points, it's generally accurate within an inch. So I wouldn't like cut glass or blinds based off of it. But if you're plumbing, if you're remodeling, if you had in the insurance market, it's more like there's a hurricane damage and there's mildew on this wall, you need to go rebuild that side of it, reconstruction. All those use cases, it's fine for.
It knows what a room should look like and says, well, that's supposed to be 8 feet.
Yeah, and because it's trained, it works on its domain. If you take it to like a football stadium or the Sistine Chapel, it won't work super well, but we trained it inside residential areas where the camera is usually no more than 10 to 20-ish feet away from the wall. There it'll work okay on.
Also was tilted.
It was what?
Didn't require things to be orthogonal.
Mm-hmm.
Room could be to tilt and it figured it out.
Yeah, I think the really powerful part, at least from the reconstruction use case, is if you forget to take a measurement when you're physically there drawing things out on paper, you're kind of out of luck. But in this case, just by building the model, we have the metric scale encoded in it. So you can tap any 2 points, it'll tell you in feet and inches how far apart they are. That's the part that even if you did nothing else, just like not needing to drive back out and fuel costs, wear and tear on the vehicle, hourly rates, and it's subcontracted, like that alone is probably tens of dollars of cost savings each time it's done. So of course, we have like telemetry, and we can see after the fact how many people are coming in and tap measuring, and we make sure that they know when renewal time comes up, like how much time we're saving them, things like that. Sir.
Moving away from Yembo optimism, the first point we're talking about 1,000 hours a year average.
Mm-hmm.
White collar job. What makes you confident that doesn't translate afterward?
So what was the question? So
what makes you confident that doesn't translate afterward? It's 1,000 out of 2,000 hours a year. argument that means half as many jobs in demand. Half the time.
I see. Trying to think of the best way to put this. When's the last time you used ChatGPT? Okay, so you're familiar. Okay. I feel like, does it still need you, or did you get the job done if you remove yourself from it? Yeah, I think that's today, but I think at the end of the day, it's a tool. And people, from what I can tell, usually you need somebody to stand behind that decision. And at least in my world, I would say if someone would be able to like crack the nut, it'd probably be me, because I don't have bureaucracy and red tape telling what I can and can't do. If I could find a way to like become twice as productive as a startup, I would totally do it. But I think the issue I'm running into is it's really good at automating certain tasks, but someone still has to do the task, get the data to put it in there, interpret the output. Sometimes it makes mistakes. So I think in the terms of this productivity, I have a hard time. If you know how to do it, let me know. I'd be happy to try it out. But I'm having a hard time not having to think about that workflow at all. I can get involved half as much, but I still have to start it. I still have to look at the output. And I think from that, it doesn't completely like drop in replace what a job is. And I think that hurdle is more than some people are thinking it is. And I could be wrong, and we could be having a very different future 4 or 5 years from now, but I think it's going to be more, people will become more efficient. You'll have less need for the same job in multiple places. And I think certain industries will go more in demand. I wouldn't want to open like a personal robot repair shop today, but 5 years from now, maybe you want to do that. And I think other ones will go in less demand. So I think it will kind of shift. And it takes time for these things to play out. I mean, I feel like smartphones came out, but it took about 10 years before it was really ubiquitous. So it does move fast, but it's not like there's nobody at the driving wheel. That makes sense. Yeah.
With the battery solving, did the AI have to be taught all the rules of chemistry first?
I don't believe so. I believe they were told the pattern that you're looking for, like these properties, and then it was given all the data. So I don't know how long it took them to like prep it to hit the go button and wait 40 hours or whatever it was.
What took so long? Didn't have chemistry.
Maybe. I mean, I would still be going if you had me do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Chem 101 didn't work out.
Let's try something else, and it teaches itself from what didn't work.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a lot of reinforcement learning, but it does it so quickly, it basically doesn't matter. I mean, there was I think it's an MIT lab where they had motor control. If you're controlling servos, if you're making like a humanoid robot or a four-wheeled robot, but like doing the control loops is a lot of very manual, usually graduate level, like the hazing project that the professor gives to the grad student. And they did this deep learning based reinforcement learning where they said, hey, your objective is to maximize the height on a humanoid robot. And it looks like a skeleton like lying on the floor, and they ran it through all these different iterations. And eventually it learned to stand up. It's no hard-coded, like if this, then that kind of logic, just your objective is this, then it ran for a while. They said, cool, now that you're up, your objective is to maximize not Z index, but X index, and then it learns walking. And the cool part is you take that approach, they put it on a spider robot, they put it on a humanoid, and it was the same approach. Just like in our world, you're doing the same thing, whether you're detecting a cat or a giraffe or a chair or a sofa, but that ability to kind of generalize and say, hey, I'm not going to tell you what it goes into being a chair, but I'm going to have you get good at telling you if it is or not. Now you're able to learn, and that makes it much more broadly applicable. I think the best example is that ImageNet competition. Before deep learning came around, where you could just teach it on examples, the state of the art was improving about like 1/10% to 0.5% year over year. Then deep learning comes out and it was about 10%. So 10 years of progress in one submission, because you didn't need a grad student to say a chair is 4 legs and a seat in the back, and it may not have a back, and they may not actually have 4 legs, and coding in all the exceptions. Just, hey, here's 1,000 examples, these are chairs. Here's 1,000 examples, these are called sofas, don't call them chairs. And then you hit go, you walk away, and NVIDIA is a $3 trillion company today because of that. Yes, sir. It's a great question because it actually changes over time. So when you have nothing and you're starting off, you basically have to say, this is it, because you have nothing. But there comes a point where you need to start doing the alternative. And I can give an example. We used to not be able to tell anything. So TV is one of the first things that we did, because if you give anyone a demo, they usually go in their living room, they try it out, and we learned if you're pitching an investor, you do conference tables and office chairs. And then when you go back in the home living rooms where we started. So we started off by identifying, drawing rectangular bounding boxes. This is a TV, this is a TV, this is a TV. And the problem that happens is then people go in their home office and they have computer monitors, big black rectangle, looks a lot like a TV. So now you want to teach it, hey, this is not a TV, it's called a computer monitor. So if you go and do the first thing you said, where you just say, this is an example, you're not really giving the model enough to learn because it just sees a big black rectangle in both cases. And you can't really go off of size because there are small TVs, there are big computer monitors. So you have to kind of change the equation. And you know you need to do that because you'll stop seeing it get better. You'll see it make mistakes. And what we saw is we turned on the TV detector, now we turned on the computer monitor detector, 50% of our TVs are now being misclassified. So if you're plotting your F1 scores, you'll see it like plummet, and all of a sudden you're making all these mistakes. So then we learned, okay, well, as a human, I can look at it, and it's relatively easy for me to tell TV from computer monitor, but what am I doing that it doesn't know? And then we had to teach it fireplaces. And so if you see it above a fireplace, I don't care about the fireplace, but computer monitors don't go above fireplaces, TVs do. And some folks on the AI team thought that was an ugly hack. I haven't seen a case where someone mounted their computer monitor above a fireplace. And we have a lot of examples along those lines where I guess barbecue grills are usually covered in those canvas, like the thick UV proof coatings. And if you dump a pile of laundry on your bed, it kind of looks like that. So we have it, I think it's, we call it the common sense engine. The AI team called it ugly hacks. But if you see a barbecue grill in the bedroom, call it laundry and add cartons. Works great. But then these are the kinds of things that practically, I think it's why self-driving cars are still not here. It's relatively easy to get 80, 90% of the way there, but in those edge cases, until you're 100, and people don't just say, oh, it's 80% sure this car won't kill me, I'll hop right in. Like you want to be 99.9999999 before people get in. And that's what keeps the industry interesting, I guess. Cool, well, thank you.
Very much.